Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Katie, and I'll be your host. Today, we are presenting Brexit Insight. The webinar is being recorded, so all lines have been muted. And before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll bring them up during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Today, our presenters include David Jindal, the Chief Marketing Officer at Seal Software. David Silver is the Director at Seal Software, where he designs and implements client solutions, along with Stuart Brock, a Director at Seal Software, who helps lend our financial services program. We will now turn it over to David Jindal.
Thank you, Katie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. And those who are listening to the recording as well. Katie, if you just go back to the previous slide, appreciate it for the moment. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Seal Software. About 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, we ran a seminar in London on this very topic. It was actually wonderfully alliteratively called Brexit Breakfast Briefing, because we had a large number of people show up at the event, where we gave them breakfast and then talked some of the issues around Brexit. And we thought it was such a good session that we thought we would turn this into a webinar and allow other people to get access to it. The content is slightly different because that was generated and driven, especially the demo part, by people in the audience. But we wanted to get those messages across, which is why we put on this webinar for you today. Since that time, the last couple of weeks, something significant happened for Seal, and that is we acquired a company called Apogee Legal. And Apogee Legal are the brains in many ways behind Brexit Insight. Now, it fundamentally uses the Seal platform, and you'll hear and see a little bit about the platform over the next 40 minutes or so. But the analytics that are required really to get the deep insight out of contracts in order to try to answer some of the questions that are going to occur with Brexit, that's the brains that Apogee have brought to the party. And I'm delighted that the two people you see on the screen, David and Stuart, used to be partners up until 2 weeks ago, and now they are colleagues. And so you will see potentially when we come to the demo, Apogee Legal on some of the screens, but that's because that's how it was built and developed. But they are now part of the Seal family, and we're delighted for that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through it. So I want to spend the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes really talking, giving you a bit of an intro into the topic, and then we'll dive into the actual meat of it. So next slide, Katie, please. So I think some of you know Seal on the line. I won't spend a lot of time giving you a background per se on Seal, but we are an contract analytics or contract discovery and analytics technology. The technology itself is built on machine learning, uses some incredibly deep models such as latent semantic indexing, natural language processing, and latent semantic index, and a bunch of other models in order to do deep text analytics and understand what is written in contracts and do that through a machine paradigm. So we are very much a leader in this space, and we have a number of patents, a lot of patents that have been awarded and patents that are in the wings, if you like. And one of the key ones is the ability to understand non-standard clauses, and that becomes important when we start to understand deviations from potentially terms and clauses that you normally would expect for your organization to have. Now, we've been in this business for about 8 years now, and we have effectively, with our customers, analyzed over 50 million contracts. So we're getting pretty good at understanding how to analyze the written word and how to pull meaning out of that, and to understand what it is that you want in terms of precision and recall and so on. So we're very much, and as you can see on the bottom, we've been recognized quite significantly with various accolades over the years, and we continue to do that. A recent one is our Gartner Award, but a bunch of different awards there. So we're in the vanguard of this space. Next slide, please. So what do we actually do? I mean, fundamentally, you can boil it down. We're a bit like Google in as far as you can ask Seal questions about your contracts, and in fact other unstructured types of content as well, but predominantly our use cases is around contracts. And pull out as simple information like where are my contracts to what's in my contracts and what clauses are in those contracts and how do those clauses compare, and fundamentally what business processes are relying on those and what decisions can we make based on what sits in those contracts. So next slide. But effectively, if you think about it, what is it that you want to do with software? Any software, it doesn't really matter what enterprise software you want to put in. If it's not doing one of these 4 things I have on the screen here, then it's probably a nice to have as opposed to an imperative. So you're either trying to help your organization save money, make money, i.e. Identify revenue opportunities, reduce risk, or to stay compliant. That's pretty much what we do with all of our clients. They do one or more of these 4 things. And I want to just give you a quick example of each, just to give you a flavor of the type of customers we have. So next slide, please. So a quick example of a company where we help them save money, a Fortune 10 life sciences company, identified $400 million worth of working capital savings by understanding what was in there, many thousands, tens of thousands of, in fact, perhaps more than that even, of procurement contracts. So these were on the buy side contracts, understanding what payment terms were in those, and then marrying those to actually what really was being paid in the spend management systems. And they were able to identify $400 million of working capital savings. So pretty significant. In terms of reducing risk, here's an example of a recent last year, 2 companies who wanted to merge, Fortune 100 companies, and they need to do a massive amount of due diligence on the contracts. This was something they need to read. One of the parties needed to read 40,000 contracts in less than a 2-week period. That's not just possible with any sort of human intervention or using junior lawyers or legal ops people. It's just not possible. So that's where our technology comes in. If you're looking at how do you generate revenue, here's an example. We've lost the actual the name of the company underneath it, or the type of company, but this is a digital signatures company, 25,000 contracts in their corpus. They wanted to be able to extract key information that would allow them to perhaps renegotiate better discount terms, or to look at unrealized opportunities sitting in those contracts. So to look at upsells, so more of a revenue-centric one. And then this last one is a bank. It's a global bank, over 1 million contracts, extracting core information, 90 different metadata extraction points to pull out for the different types of agreement, pull out core information to allow them to be able to report to the Fed on things like their ISDA master agreements, their qualified financial contracts, their IS 14-9 capabilities, etc. So this is just examples of how the various use cases that people are putting seal towards at the moment. Next slide. And yeah, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we are a global organization, and we tend to focus large on some industries where those key things we talked about, like risk and compliance and saving money, become key drivers. So that's in the telco space, high tech, financial services, process manufacturing, discrete manufacturing, and so on. Next slide, please. But fundamentally, what we're asking are what you might call business critical questions, whether you're talking about on the procurement side, so on the buy side, whether it's on the sell side around optimizing revenue and getting more out of your contracts that you've negotiated with your customers, whether it's reducing risk, or whether it's delivering a status of where you are contractually with your customers and your suppliers for your C-suite. But above all, next button, please. But above all, fundamentally, when we're talking about Brexit, that isn't just a business critical question. It's a mother of a business critical question. If you are a UK company, especially, clearly, if you're an EU company, even it's just as important, and actually US companies as well. Brexit is a key issue today, and that's really going to be the subject of the rest of this session. Next slide. And despite we don't know where this is going, there is massive uncertainty, and there's all those options on the left-hand side. None of those it's not defined which way this is going to go, but all of them, depending, it doesn't matter which way we go, whether it's hard, soft, whether we leave, Britain leaves without any agreement at all, it's going to drive these business challenges. And so getting ahead of these challenges becomes a key challenge now, and a key requirement for organizations to be as prepared as they can be based on what we know today. Next slide. Because, if you are living in the UK right now, or you follow the UK news, unfortunately, pretty much this is top of the agenda pretty much every day, unless something else happens like the World Cup comes along. It's pretty much the #1 topic. On the left-hand side, this is my favorite magazine. I've read it for the last 30 years, sort of satirical magazine. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is the current edition. You can see how much this is embedded in the political system today, right now. And and helpfully we have people like Donald Trump coming over and giving their views on it. We have people resigning from the cabinet, and we have Barnier trying to play a hardball. So it is a mess. So what do you do in this uncertainty? Next slide. What you need to do is to start to really ask yourself some fundamental questions, right? Which is, what is this going to mean for my supply chain? What does this mean from an exchange rate perspective? Are there opportunities under here? Because for every difficult situation, there's always opportunities to make money as well. So, are there opportunities that we can pick up through this by understanding what are sitting in our contracts? What risks are associated with it? We need to get ahead of this before June 2019, way before then, and then be able to pivot based on what type of outcome we have when Britain actually decides whether it's going to leave with a hard, soft, or no deal at all. Next slide. And so, really, understanding your contractual relations becomes a key requirement today. Understand your contracts, understand what clauses relate to trading in the EU and the UK. Do I need to rewrite those clauses? Does it mean that you can utilize things like force majeure? How have your contracts been written such that they reflect the EU position with respect to the UK and vice versa? And so, understanding your existing contracts is key. And then future contracts. So as you write contracts today for over the next year or so, and you're a British company or an EU company or a US company, what language do I need to put into my contracts to protect me as much as possible for any of the uncertainty and issues that may arise or will arise as Brexit is defined and as Brexit starts to be initiated? Next slide. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is going to be the subject of the demo and the work that Apogee have done. But you've got to start looking at some of these types of clauses that are sitting in your contracts to really understand what your exposure would be, and potentially what lines of opportunity open up based on these types of clauses that have been negotiated in your tens, thousands, hundred thousands, even millions of contracts that some of our clients have. So with that, I'm going to pass over to David, who's going to take us through the background to what Apogee have built with the Brexit Insight pack. David?
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see the deck. I'll do a quick introduction as David did. My name is David Silbert. I'm a director at Seal Software. Before joining Seal and developing products and solutions in the AI space, I was a practicing lawyer for 7 years at King & Spalding, and doing private equity, and Norton Rose Fulbright, doing capital markets work. So I come to this from the perspective of an attorney looking for a tool to make my life easier and design solutions that allow me to do my work in a more efficient and effective manner, right? So with that, let's get right into Brexit. First off, wouldn't it be great if there were a straightforward clause in all of our agreements that told us exactly what to expect in the face of Brexit, right? And here we have an example up here that has a big tail in it. We could drive a truck through to say, okay, well, whatever comes out of GDPR in UK after Brexit, now David has me in a tongue twister from his example this morning. Post-Brexit, what is the impact going to be, right? How will that change in law impact your agreement? And as David alluded to earlier, we had a seminar in London where we had a live audience, which was a privilege, right? Because we got to engage them and ask them, well, what topics are you most concerned about in light of Brexit? Obviously, governing law, right? No surprise. You're going to want to know how your governing law's provision is drafted today. What currency, as David alluded to earlier, is also at play, right? Whether you're hedging or conducting your transactions under a specific currency, what will the effects be? Taxation issues. How is territory defined, right? We'll come up and talk about this in the context of license grants. Termination rights. What mechanisms are in place or could be triggered for termination in light of Brexit? Force majeure. What remedy can you avail yourself under a force majeure clause if the changes in Brexit prove your agreement to be impracticable? And this was the big one. I'll highlight this one. Change in law. If you have a change in law clause in your agreement today, how is it drafted? And it comes in a lot of different varieties, and this can have a material impact on the effect of Brexit in your agreements, right? So let's pull up a few examples. Here we have one that's pretty open-ended, right? So whatever the case may be for the code or the tax law referenced here, as changes come out after Brexit, applicable successor provisions or laws will allow you to move forward, right? You're not going to have to redraft. It anticipates changes in law. And again, we're highlighting sort of the key differences in these various clauses, right? So here it's saying to the extent the change in law clause is triggered, well, the parties will just negotiate in good faith to revise the agreement and try to preserve the intent as set forth herein, right? So at least there's a mechanic here where you go and say, okay, now we know we have a change in law. We need to get together with our counterparty and work together to try to resolve this. Of course, that means time, expense, and effort, but at least it's somewhat anticipated. And here's one where they're getting a little more specific. You're going to cooperate, but you're going to do it under the same economic terms, right? So at least you don't have to worry, at least the hope is, you don't have to worry about re-engaging on other aspects of the agreement, including the economics, if you have to go back and renegotiate. Here's another one. And here they're saying the costs associated with the renegotiation will be split equitably between the parties. Now, of course, what does equitably mean? But at least here there's some effort in your agreement to say, okay, if the parties have to re-engage, we'll divide costs between us. Now, this is a big one, but let's drill down to the end here and see that one party has agreed to bear all the costs here, right? So if your practice had been to accept all the costs associated with any change of law, you may have a material impact if you're going to have to negotiate that across thousands of agreements and bear that cost on your own, right? So good to know if you have a change in law clause like this one. And finally, we have two clauses here. Up top, we have a change in law clause, and below we have a force majeure. And let's start with the change in law. This is a pretty critical one, right? Because it's giving the right to terminate in the event of change of law, right? You may have other termination rights, and we'll touch on those in a minute. But if your change in law provision triggers a termination right, you may want to know that in light of Brexit. And let's talk about force majeure for a moment. These are somewhat related, but it depends on how it's drafted. And that's the punchline here, right? If your force majeure clause anticipates changes in law or something similar to that effect, well, then you may have an option here, a remedy here for your inability to perform based on changes under Brexit. But it's really going to come down to how it's drafted. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. So another critical thing to think about when you're tackling Brexit is what is the role in the relationships of the parties under various agreements. If you're looking at a relationship between a supplier and a customer, obviously economic terms are going to be critical, right? So issues related to taxation, currency, etc., those are going to be paramount. If you're looking at an IP agreement where you have a licensor and licensee, territory will be critical, right? You're going to want to know where your license grant is applicable and if that's been affected by Brexit. Borrower and lender. In a lending context, right, issues whether it's your rates, LIBOR, or most likely your borrower is going to end up bearing the cost associated with revisions and change of law provisions affected by Brexit, right? So understanding these relationships and using the tool to help you suss that out will take you far down the road. Let's spend a little more time on key topics, right? We talked about change of law, change in law already. But obviously this is going to be paramount, right? You're probably going to want to start here and figure out what remedies, what relief, or what challenges lie ahead under your change of law provision. Primarily, do you have one in place, right? Same with force majeure. Do you have a force majeure clause? Does it anticipate government acts? Is there language that qualifies that to the extent that it says beyond the reasonable control of a party, right? Does it anticipate unforeseeable changes in law, right? Force majeure comes in a variety of flavors. And because force majeure isn't statutorily defined as a term, but more a product of common law, you're going to have to know what the definition is specifically in your agreements to figure out whether or not you can avail yourself of the provision. Severability, right? So if Brexit has made one of the terms of your agreement, illegal, impracticable, what does this clause say? Will you be able to sever that specific clause out of your agreement and move forward, or is there potentially a bust in your agreement? Territory, we talked about this briefly in the context of IP, but depending on how your territory is defined, it may affect something very practical like your license grant, right? Currency. David alluded to this already. This has a pretty big impact and it cuts many different ways, right? So whether you're hedging currency, you're conducting your business under a specific currency, any taxation issues that may flow from that currency, you need to know what the currency terms are under your agreement. And again, we talked about in the lending context issues related to interest rates such as LIBOR. Taxation specifically, right? Here we're talking about that, but any taxation issues that can be impacted and affected by Brexit, you're going to want to identify those and figure out what the economic impact will be on your agreement. Termination for convenience, right? If all else fails and you're at an impractical position, do one or both of the parties have the ability to just go ahead and terminate the agreement because they've said post-Brexit, this isn't going to work for us anymore. We'd like to get out of the agreement. Well, who has that right? Is it there at all, right? What notice is required? Here you can see 6 months prior written notice. And then also importantly, are there any fees associated with that termination for convenience right? Because you're going to want to know the economic and practical efficiencies around such a provision so you can make a strategic decision to say, do we want to terminate for convenience? Or because of the penalties that are associated with that, we are better off moving forward even with the challenges around Brexit under the agreement. Termination for cause. Also, you're going to want to suss out your termination rights there and make sure you understand whether or not this could be implicated post-Brexit. Transition services. If you are going to have to exit your agreement post-Brexit, do you have a clause in place to provide transition services post-termination, right? And then finally, amendment. Do you have a mechanic baked into your agreement that will let the parties come together and efficiently amend and update the agreement to resolve issues around Brexit? And with that, I'm going to pass to my colleague, Stuart, who's going to talk a little bit more about the challenge around Brexit. Stuart?
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Just a little bit about myself before I get started here. I am a licensed attorney and practiced privately for almost 10 years. I left private practice and went in-house at Bank of America, and during my nearly 10 years at the bank, I helped to manage or was responsible largely for the governance and controls in the procurement organization. I managed the global templates in that process as well as deployed processes to achieve compliance with changing laws, rules, and regs. So I know what it takes to manage the deployment of major operational changes at an enterprise level where you have sweeping changes in laws, rules, and regs, as you see here with Brexit. I know that you have to know where you stand. You have to analyze the data and identify what you know and attempt to identify what you don't know. You have to develop a comprehensive plan as quickly as possible. You cannot take a wait and see approach. You really have to get out in front of this thing. I know that you have to understand that even the best laid plans will require changes. As laws and regulations like Brexit are implemented, they can change. So you must have a plan that will allow for these changes, and you need to be prepared to respond to them. In order to do this, you need to have a dynamic tool that can change with you and your plan. SEAL is just that tool. David, next slide, please. So the challenge, how do we prepare for Brexit in this uncertainty when we really don't know how things are going to land and we still don't have any kind of basic insight into the direction? The Bank of England has warned that material risks remain with contracts valued at trillions of pounds. With this kind of uncertainty, markets can begin to suffer. Folks could begin to get into a state of panic. And the Bank of England has said that these risks are largely present where there's action or some kind of decision to be made by the UK and EU authorities. The most important risk at this point that I see is that we simply don't have any framework to support any temporary permissions that would accommodate a transition from the current state contracts into a future state in the world of Brexit. So how do companies then know how to review the thousands and thousands of contracts? Will they be forced to review them manually? What happens when Brexit comes through and there's a process change? Will the companies be forced to go back through those documents and re-review them manually again? Next slide, David. The solution is Seal's Brexit Insight. Brexit Insight is the most comprehensive contract analysis solution for Brexit. It couples the power of Seal's AI platform with the depth of subject matter expertise of the Seal legal team. It offers you the ability to dig deep into Brexit-related contract topics, and it also provides you a dynamic platform to handle those changes that occur as Brexit is implemented. Next slide. Brexit Insight provides you unrivaled level of detailed information. It provides actionable insights into the company's contract portfolios, and this is absolutely critical. Companies need to know what kinds of actions they need to take so that they can prioritize and ensure that they can come into compliance. Brexit Insight substantially eliminates the cost and time of manual reviews. I have actually managed large teams of lawyers and paralegals who are extracting data from contracts. Those are very time intensive, they're resource intensive, and they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Brexit Insight supports rapid training for customized topics. So as things change, companies have unique positions, those things can be adapted into the Insight pack. It also includes critical subject matter updates as things change throughout the Brexit process. Next slide, David. Brexit isn't just a yes-no kind of tool. It addresses the Brexit-related topics, and then it takes a deeper dive into those layers of content beneath each of those topics. An example being force majeure. It just doesn't say force majeure is or is not present in the contract. It actually begins to dig into those layers and looks at such topics as foreseeability and changes in law. You probably won't see Brexit in any particular provision in your existing or legacy contracts, but you can look for things such as changes of law and legality and impossibility. Next slide, David. So Brexit Insight provides you a level of detail that's unrivaled into your basic Brexit topics as well as more complex topics. And as you see here, we cover the gamut from governing law to dispute resolution, currency and pricing, employment matters, GDPR, taxes and tariffs, and so on and so on. So with that, I'll take a pause. I'll transition back to David, and David will take us through a demo of the platform.
Thank you, Stuart. Let's do just that. I will pull up a few things to show you and show you, now that we've talked about it in the abstract, how this practically comes to bear, right? So first, I'm going to show you Brexit sort of at scale and tell you a little bit about our approach to how we design this product and roll it out. What you're looking at here, to David's point, you've got a legacy vestige here, a mention of Apogee up top, but this is part of Seal Solution, and this is our beta platform where we display and can show you the scope and breadth of our packs, right? And here you see we have a few different things, right? In fact, some of you on the phone may already be using some of these analytics, GDPR Insight, vendor compliance, but today, since we're focusing on Brexit, let's do a deep dive here. I'll simply come in, I'm going to click here and pull up all the different topics that we are deploying as part of Brexit Insight, right? Now, some of these we've talked through already today, but you can see there's a variety of topics available to review and deploy here. And I'm going to back up one page and show you a few more. So we've talked about a variety of things, but let's focus on force majeure for a moment, right? we talked about the need to figure out whether or not generally your agreement is going to have a definition of force majeure in it, right? Because it's not something that's going to apply by default. And so this analytic, the way we've designed the approach is to say, okay, we know we have a large topic out here of force majeure, but what are all the individual things we're going to want to know about force majeure clauses, right? So here's the general one. Does the agreement contain a definition of force majeure? That's going to be your start point. But from then, you're also going to want to know, and we saw some examples of this already, what flavor of force majeure clause do you have? Does it address the concept of being reasonably foreseeable? Does it address circumstances beyond control? And the reason this matters is as you're attempting to evaluate Brexit and your remedies under your agreement, you're going to need to know which definition applies. And we'll start to see what actually happens as courts and other disputes or debates lead to how this will be interpreted. But you'll want to know, based on this precise wording of your clause, which of these is going to be the hole through which you try to fit in Brexit, particularly if it doesn't address law directly, right? So backing out again, you can see there's a few GDPR items here, a few general items that are going to be relevant, and we'll show a few more just because there's quite a bit here, right? A lot that pertains to governing law and jurisdictions, right? Generally, it's governing law addressed. Does it address arbitration, right? How does it pertain to affiliates? What other specific regulatory regimes are invoked in the contract, right? So rather than just go through this laundry list, because I feel like I've been giving you a laundry list this entire presentation, why don't we look at the tool itself? And I'll give you an opportunity here to see these analytics actually deployed in a publicly in a database full of publicly available contracts, right? So what you're looking at for those who haven't seen it before, and I'm going to be pretty light on SEAL basics here because I know we have a lot of SEAL users in the audience today as well, but for those who haven't seen it, what you're looking at is the basic landing page for the SEAL interface. And what you're getting right off the bat right here in the dashboard is the number of contracts that have been processed in this database, and right now you can see there's almost 1,700. So let's go in and look at the contracts themselves. What you can see here on the far right is an inventory of those contracts, right? And they're listed by file name. And right now you're only looking at 10, right? 10 out of the roughly 1,700. You can look at as few as 5, 50 at a time, but it's just a way to orient yourself in your list of contracts in your environment. You, of course, also have the ability to sort them alphabetical or reverse alphabetical, chronological, or reverse chronological order depending on last modified, right? So that's your basic orientation with your contracts in your tool. You also have the ability to do some basic searching right off the bat, which is great. So in the context of Brexit, we've been talking about force majeure. Let's see how many agreements specifically reference force majeure. And keep this number in mind, right? Right now it's showing there's 657. Well, that's all well and good, and basic searching is great if all you're doing is looking for a precise phrase. But as you'll see, as we look at the analytics in a moment, there's a lot more to it than that, right? And we'll focus on force majeure in depth here in just a moment. Another great feature of the tool is the ability to drill down directly into critical issues without even having to search, right? We've talked about governing law. If governing law, which obviously is critical for Brexit, is where you want to start, well, the tool helps do that right away, right? And if you want to know if your agreement is governed by the law of England and Wales, well, here are your 35 agreements that are going to be governed by the law of England and Wales as drafted in the agreement, right? So that's just a little bit about basics of the tool to show you analytics versus searching, and the power of having both at your disposal to tackle any issue, and particularly here, issues related to Brexit. But instead, let's look at what the pack can do. What I've done is I've created a saved search that contains 4 different agreements. And I chose these because everyone's going to recognize, and again, these are publicly available contracts, but everyone will recognize IBM and Cisco. And more to the point here in the light of Brexit, you'll see that these all pertain to different regions, right? So let's grab these 4 agreements side by side, 1, 2, 3, 4, and display them together. And let me tell you what you're looking at. What you see now is extraction of key terms driven by the analytics across all 4 agreements. Starting at the far left, going top to bottom, these are the analytics that are being run, and left to right across the agreements, they're returning their results. But right now, every single analytic in the tool is being deployed, so let's narrow our focus down a little bit to things that are relevant for the item we're talking about today, Brexit Insight. And let's start up here with force majeure, a concept near and dear to our hearts. Here is the general force majeure analytic out deployed against these 4 agreements. And what you can see immediately is IBM has not included a force majeure clause in their agreements. Cisco, however, has done so, right? This is a very straightforward yes or no, is force majeure addressed? But to the point we made earlier, you're going to want to know more than that. What if your force majeure clause contains the requirement that it be an event beyond the affected party's reasonable control? And as you can see here, that's what this analytic does. It takes the general yes answer and subdivides it a little bit and tells you and gives you more insight to say it's going to actually contain this specific phrase, right? And that's the phrase that was selected to govern this force majeure agreement. Next, you'll see that these agreements address taxation. These agreements contain severance clauses, here particularly for terms of sale, but a severance clause nonetheless. These do define a territory. And finally, they all contain termination for convenience right. So again, going from the abstract, we knew these were critical issues. We've designed a tool with analytics that will give you that information at the clause level across your agreements. Now, I'd like to show you a little bit more on force majeure to show you the power of analytics versus basic searching. And what I've done is I've gone to a different tab here to show you the interface where you can create your analytics. And let's do one together. I'm going to create just a test analytic here with my initials. I'm going to create that policy. One, this will show you the breadth and power of what the tool can do and how easily it can do it. And then 2, we're going to show you specifically for a relevant topic how this works. So let's go into this new policy. And let's find an example of language that's going to be relevant for Brexit. I'm going to find a new paragraph example. And let's focus on force majeure because not all agreements are going to say force majeure, right? But what matters and what the analytics can accomplish is it can find the concept. David touched on all the different models that are deployed to help you get there. And let's look at that in action. So rather than looking for force majeure, let's look for the phrase act of God, right? We know that that's relevant to force majeure, but it's not force majeure by name. So I'm going to hit search. And you can see Seal went out and immediately said there's 109 agreements that contain the phrase act of God. Let's pick a popular or well-known business. Let's do IBM. Let's view that agreement, and let's look for the act of God phrase in the agreement. And sure enough, here is the clause, right? And it's a force majeure clause. Let's teach the model how to go out and find this. And what Seal will do is once I've identified my clause, and I know it's on point, I click add and find similar, and it immediately goes out into the document population to find similar agreements, right? And here we know these are going to be keyed off act of God, but we want to know if they pertain to force majeure. So let's type in force majeure just to see if there's any reference. And what you'll see right away is not all of these reference force majeure, but nonetheless, they're force majeure clauses, right? So this is the value of robust analytics versus basic searching, right? Of course, this is a pretty straightforward topic, but you can imagine having the ability to do this across a number of topics, all of which we've pre-built, pre-designed for the Brexit use case, right? And with that, I'm going to come back to our presentation. And we will move forward. And I will pass it back to Stuart.
Thanks, David. So what do we do with all the data that Brexit Insight can give us? How do we turn that into something that we can get our arms around and actually begin to get into those actionable items? There are several built-in reporting capabilities for the pack. And what you see here is one of them. This is a scorecard view. What this does is it allows you to look across your entire contract population and look by topic and subtopic as to whether or not those things are addressed in those contracts. And so we've taken a sample here of some publicly available contracts just to give you a view of this so that you can see in each contract, is force majeure addressed? Is it defined? And then what about the sub-elements? Beyond control? Is it change in law and possibility? Reasonably foreseeable? So you can see contract by contract, side by side, where those items are addressed and where they are not addressed. Next slide, David. In addition to that contract by contract view, there's a dashboard view that gives you an overall aggregate view of the various parts and pieces that make up those elements. So you can see here that we've taken a look into force majeure, early termination, and territory. And we've looked inside of each of those topics at the subtopics, and we've seen what's there and what's not there. And based on that, we can roll up then and say, for these critical elements, this is the amount of contracts that don't have it. This is the amount of contracts that do. And we can begin to prioritize where major amendments are required, multiple topics across multiple contracts, or where minor amendments are required, where generally you would have a fewer number of topics or number of issues to be amended. This dashboard level view gives your executive and management team level direct insight into the portfolio and can help to make decisions around budgeting and timeline. Next slide, David. In addition, we can do reporting that allows you to see that level of content that we've been talking about. So in this example, we're looking at currency and pricing, and you can see that the agreement is addressed, the topic is addressed in the vast majority of these agreements. And then you can look at each of the elements. You can see that termination is largely addressed across the board, whereas payment and pricing may not be directly addressed. So this gives you a level of insight into the topics that can help you then judge whether or not your templates are being managed correctly, if there's regulatory change and you might need to update those templates, and then also how to manage that legacy contract population. Next slide. So what's in the box? What is it that you get? You get a comprehensive analytics set that sits on the SAIL platform and can give you this level of content that we've been talking about. You get a user guide, which gives you the information about what to expect for each of the analytics. You get users' views and queries. It gives you sort of that playbook, these things that we've been looking at, and then ongoing updates that are part of the routine updates that go on with the pack. So with that, we'll take the next slide, David, and we'll move to questions. So for those of you who might have a question, you can type them into the question feature for the GoToWebinar tool. And I think we already have a couple of questions. So David, I'll turn it over to you to take care of those.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it looks like we've got a couple that have come in. And the first one reads, what if our organization has certain requirements that aren't included in the set you have described here? Well, this isn't our first pack. We've had several packs in the past, and we've had a lot of customers use those. And we've had several customers come to us and say, these are fantastic, but we have a few items that are peculiar to our business that we'd also like to roll into this process. And while those items were outside of the pack, we were fortunate. Our analytics production group designs custom analytics for use cases every day, right? And we'd be happy to discuss what's involved in designing an enhanced or bespoke solution for you. And you're welcome to reach out to any of us, either through the information on the screen or to us directly. And we'd be happy to talk to you about, how do you leverage Brexit Insight, but then also if you need something particular around that, how we can help you get there. So I hope that answers the first one. The second one, we are an existing SEAL customer. How complex is it to install Brexit Insight on our system? Well, the good news is it's really easy, and there's actually minimal implementation effort. We would simply take the Brexit analytics and user guide and items that have identified here and put them in on the back end of the tool, and we'd install a playbook. And for those of you who used the tool before, that's what gives you your sort of question and answer format within the tool itself. We'll confirm that the process took appropriately, and then basically you're good to go. So with our user guide, which would explain to you, and you saw a little bit of this when we were looking at our beta version of the Q&A format. So with that user guide that explains sort of how all these things come together, it'll be pretty seamless from a UI perspective, right? You'll go in and use the tool much as you have before, only now you're going to have the additional suite of analytics to complete the specific Brexit analysis. And Stuart, are there any others? I know you're monitoring the questions.
Thanks, David. Let's see. Bear with me just a second. We have one question here. Would Brexit Insight work as well in a German language and legislation environment? David, do you want to give an answer there?
Sure. So the answer is SEAL works in a variety of languages. We are currently working on an initiative right now to further build out some of the PAC analytics, like Brexit Insight, specifically in the German language. So there is functional capability there today, but it's still, still a work in progress. So it's a high priority item for us, and we continue to develop that. We'd be happy to talk about any particular application where we could prioritize, even based on a customer need, which of those get escalated. And so, for whoever's in the audience that would like to talk about that, please reach out to us, because we'd be happy to prioritize any items, here from the PAC for further development to accelerate that and get that to you as soon as possible.
Thank you, David. Another question we have is, how long does it take to teach the PAC to find all the clauses that I want?
I can answer that. So it was the question, how long does it take to teach the PAC to find all the clauses I want? This is sort of the brilliant thing, if I understood your question correctly. The brilliant thing about this is it's a pre-designed solution, right? It takes relatively minimal time to deploy this. We've already built these analytics, right? So it's simply a question of figuring out the volume of agreements, how we're going to apply the software, and then ultimately, so whether or not that's in a, the secure cloud environment or has to be an on-premises install, the mechanics are just getting it in. But in terms of actually deploying the analytics, it takes relatively little time. They're already designed. If anything, it's just a question of making sure they've been deployed properly and making sure that they're performing as expected. But this is already a pre-designed solution, right? That's the advantage of the PAC. What I showed you in terms of in the SCA interface, where we created that force majeure analytic together in the demonstration today, that's simply just a demonstration of how that works. We don't have to do that for each of these topics. It's already been done and been done in a far more robust fashion than the manner we demonstrated today. I hope that answers the question.
At this time, David, that's all the questions that we currently have. So we'll hand it back over to Katie.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate taking your time to join us today. The record will be made available shortly, and thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time.